Late July 1944, one of the bloodiest and at the same time unknown battles of World War II is about to begin. This confrontation took place near the Narva River on the current border of Russia and Estonia and will be known as the Battle of the Blue Hills. In it, some 22,000 foreign soldiers belonging to the Waffen-SS from the Nordland and Nederland divisions faced several Soviet armies with a total of almost 150,000 troops. Before analyzing this battle, let's briefly put it into context. In mid-January 1944, the Soviets launched their final offensive that ended up breaking the German siege of Leningrad, which had begun 2.5 years earlier. This offensive led to the new German defensive line being established in February near the Narva River and Lake Peipus. From this point on, the Red Army launched one attack after another against the German defensive line with the intention of gaining access to the Baltic states. It is estimated that from February to July 1944, the Soviets launched a total of 5 major offensives along with a series of smaller attacks. Again and again, the Soviets were repelled at the cost of heavy casualties that amounted to close to 300,000 troops. During the major offensive in March, one of the most daring individual actions of the war took place, in which Philip Wild, a Panther commander of the Nordland Division, destroyed some 14 T-34S and stopped the Red Army's breakthrough in its tracks. For this action, he won the long-awaited Knight's Cross. Despite the German successes in containing the Soviets near the Narva River, the situation in other sectors of the front began to become critical. On June 22, 1944, the Red Army launched one of the largest operations of the war, which became known as Operation Bagration. This massive assault annihilated Army Group Center in Byelorussia, creating a collapse in the German defensive lines. As a result, Army Group North was left in an extremely vulnerable position, at imminent risk of being surrounded and isolated along the Baltic coast. This strategic threat seriously compromised the German ability to maintain control in the region. Because of this increasingly real danger, Army Group North's general, Johannes Friebner, proposed to Hitler a withdrawal of all his troops to the vicinity of Riga. Hitler's reaction was one of total rejection, and he told him that his troops should defend the front line on the Narva River to the last man. However, Army Group North was very weakened and no longer had any reserves. In this way, Friebner warned that they would hardly withstand a new Soviet attack. Finally, the German general proposed to withdraw to a new defensive line called the Tannenberg Line, which was only 15 kilometers west of the Narva instead of 400 kilometers, as the city of Riga was. After further study, Hitler granted this withdrawal on July 22nd. While the Germans were preparing to withdraw, the Soviets surprised them with a new massive attack in the sector that began on July 24th. This attack panicked some German units, who eventually gave way in the sector south of the Narva River. Thus, by July 25th, many German units retreating west of Narva were trapped in a very narrow corridor near the town of Siname. To support their defense, units of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps under the command of General Felix Steiner took advantage of 3 hills in the sector. The 3 hills extend from east to west. The eastern hill was known to Estonians as Orphanage Hill, the central one was called Grenadier Hill, and the westernmost was called Love Hill or Tower Hill. The heights have steep slopes and rise between 20 and 50 m above the surrounding terrain. The location of the units of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps in the Siname sector, known as the Blue Hills, was as follows. The 4th SS Panzer Grenadier Brigade Nederland entrenched itself on the left flank of the Tannenberg Line. Units of the 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division Estonia in the center, and the 11th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland on the right flank. Finally, the SS Division Langemark was placed in reserve. Soviet Marshal Leonid Govorov considered the Tannenberg Line to be the key position of Army Group North and gathered the best units he had to launch the new attack. Thus, the 2nd Shock Army prepared to attack the German positions from the east and the Soviet 8th Army from the south. In total, there were about 11 infantry divisions and 6 tank regiments. approximately 22,200 Axis soldiers, half of them Estonian, and the other half from countries such as Norway, Holland, or Denmark, would face in this battle against about 150,000 Soviet troops. Similarly, the difference in tanks was 20-1 in favor of the Red Army. It is estimated that the total number of tanks on the German side was between 80 and 90, while the Soviets had about 1,800. These included some of the new IS-2. Finally, it should be noted that German General Friebner was removed from command just as the retreat to these new positions was underway, and Ferdinand Schorner had just replaced him in command of Army Group North, which would soon be on the verge of annihilation. On the 26th of July, pursuing the retreating Germans, the Soviet attack fell on the Tannenberg Line before the men of the Nordland Division had settled there. The Soviet Air Force and artillery fired thousands of bombs and shells at the German positions, destroying most of the forest on the hills. The Soviet 201st and 256th Rifle Divisions, supported by the 98th Tank Regiment, then assaulted the SS Nordland Division positions and were able to take the eastern side of Orphanage Hill. The position was held thanks to several sections of the Langemarck Division that arrived as reinforcements. During that night, an anti-tank company of the Langemarck Division was able to recapture the part of the Orphanage Hill that had been lost a few hours earlier. On the morning of the 27th of July, Soviet forces began another heavy artillery bombardment of Sinemai. Anticipating an enemy infantry attack, Steiner concentrated his few operational armored vehicles, consisting of 7 tanks, just north of the town, between the Orphanage and Grenadier Hills. The remnants of the Nordland Division were also positioned there. The main Soviet attack on that day was concentrated on the Orphanage Hill and the members of the Langemarck Division, who were located south of the hill. During the attack, the Soviets used 50 armored vehicles, with which they intended to reoccupy the hill. However, the Flemish volunteers managed to destroy 14 armored vehicles using their Panzerfausts and initially repulsed the attack. However, they were soon outnumbered and had to abandon their position and retreat to Grenadier Hill. They left behind about 60 men who, together with some Estonians, were tasked with resisting the Soviet attack and covering the retreat of their comrades. Further north of Orphanage Hill, the Soviet Second Shock Army launched another attack, which was again repulsed by Steiner's men. In the end, the only successful attack was the one on Orphanage Hill itself, and after annihilating the few men who remained to cover the retreat of the Flemish soldiers, the Red Army captured it during the early afternoon. While these clashes were taking place, the new commander of Army Group North arrived in the vicinity of the town of Sinemai and ordered counterattacks to be launched to recapture it. Shortly after a meeting, the commander of the Nordland Division, Fritz von Scholz, was hit by a shell fragment in front of his command post and killed. Following Schorner's order, a Nordland battalion and an Estonian battalion launched an attack on the Orphanage Hill, which failed after suffering heavy losses. The Orphanage Hill thus fell permanently under Soviet control, while the soldiers of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps withdrew to the Grenadier Hill. The Soviet artillery then concentrated its attacks on this new hill, while the infantry and tanks of the Second Shock Army prepared to attack again. The morning of July 28th began with a new Soviet attack that attempted to outflank Grenadier Hill from the north. During this engagement, another high-profile action took place, involving a Belgian named Remy Schreinen of the Langemarck Division. Using a 75mm anti-tank gun known as the PAK-40, this sergeant first destroyed 4 Soviet tanks, followed by another 6 in the afternoon. The action earned him a Knight's Cross. The battle ended for the Belgian soldier when an IS-2 tank charged directly at him. Both guns fired simultaneously. The IS-2 was destroyed, but the explosion blew Schreinen away from its gun. Severely wounded, he was not found until several hours after the engagement. To forestall a German retreat from the hill, the Russians bombed the Axis soldiers west of the hill. However, the men of the Langemarck Division advanced into no man's land, again repulsing the Russian attack. This victory came at the cost of the Langemarck Division being virtually annihilated. Because of this, it was unable to participate in another major engagement. That same night, the Germans attempted to recapture Orphanage Hill, but all attacks were repulsed by the Russians. Finally, Steiner ordered the withdrawal of all forces to the new defensive line on Grenadier Hill. On July 29th, intense Soviet artillery bombardment began again. The Germans, well entrenched, suffered very few casualties. After the artillery attack ceased, 6,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by armored vehicles, attacked Grenadier Hill. The 109th Rifle Division assaulted the northern flank, defended by the Nederland Division, while the 72nd and 120th Rifle Divisions attacked the Estonian soldiers from the east. The flanking attack from the north was repulsed by the Dutch, who managed to inflict heavy losses on the Soviets. However, to the south, the Soviets were able to encircle the defenders and reach the Hill of Love. The German bunkers that had been built there were poorly defended and were destroyed one after another. In addition, the Soviet armored vanguard managed to reach the town of Vaivara, marking the furthest point of the Russian advance until September of that same year. This penetration threatened to encircle Felix Steiner's troops further east, holding out in the hills. By midday on July 29th, Soviet forces had almost captured most of the Tannenberg defensive line, although the tops of the two westernmost hills were still holding out. On the other hand, Steiner ordered his last tanks to try to hold the road between Tallinn and Narva, along which his troops would have to retreat if Soviet pressure continued to increase. The German panzers headed towards Vaivara and ended up forcing their enemy to retreat. While this attack was taking place, the Soviets captured Love Hill. After much effort, a group of Norwegian and Estonian soldiers were able to retake Love Hill, suffering heavy losses. At this point in the battle, heavy fighting was taking place along the entire line, with both sides suffering heavy losses. In total, the Soviets launched 8 attacks to capture Grenadier Hill, but all of them were repulsed. By the 30th of July, a massive artillery attack wiped out most of Steiner's soldiers still holding Grenadier Hill under German control. However, a new Soviet infantry and armored attack to take the hill failed again, losing at least 12 tanks. Despite the heavy losses, the Soviet Second Shock Army failed to achieve its objectives during the month of July. In August, the lines were reorganized, and there was a lull in the fighting. Although the SS units inflicted heavy losses on the Russians, they also suffered significant casualties. By this time, the strength of the Nederland Division amounted to 1 regiment and the Langemark to only several reinforced companies. On the other hand, the 2nd Estonian Regiment ceased to exist as an effective unit. Between the 29th of July and the 10th of August, the Russians continued to launch multiple attacks without success. Finally, on August 10th, the Leningrad Front War Council ordered a halt to attacks on the Tannenberg Line. The battle left a devastating balance: 10,000 German casualties along with a dozen tanks lost, compared to more than 100,000 casualties and 160 tanks lost. The Hills of Love and the Grenadiers remained under German control until mid-September, when Army Group North had to retreat due to the danger of being surrounded. A few weeks later, the entire Army Group North, with at least 30 divisions, was surrounded in Courland, as we saw in a program I posted a few months ago about the Courland Pocket. So, what did you think of this program about the famous Battle of the Blue Hills? If you want to see how the German siege of Leningrad was broken, or the subsequent battle in Courland, I leave both programs in the description. Greetings to everyone and see you next Sunday. See you soon.